Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sheila's Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about that time after World War I, known as the Roaring Twenties. The Roaring Twenties. Now, what was going to happen with the United States after World War I? Are we going to go back to imperializing other nations? Are we going to go back to being isolationists? Well, we'll start off with the politics, the presidents of the Roaring Twenties. So after the Great War had ended in 1918, a presidential election loomed in the near future of 1920. President Wilson suffered a stroke, but he hoped to run for a third term as president. Instead of that happening, the Democratic Party put forth James Cox from Ohio and his running mate, future President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The Republican Party chose Warren G. Harding from Ohio, and Harding chose Calvin Coolidge as his running mate. The uncertainty of what the post-war America was going to look like, Harding ran on a campaign that promised the return of the country to stability and prosperity. Harding called his promise a return to normalcy. Warren Harding won the election of 1920 in a landslide, winning over 60% of the popular vote, and the Republican decided it was time to get the government out of business again. Harding decided that he would first implement a series of tax cuts for the wealthy. During the war, if you remember, the wealthy were being taxed nearly 67%, and immediately after, those taxes remained. The U.S. was suffering from some economic downfall and a recession when Harding called on his Treasury Secretary, Andrew Mellon, to figure out a way to improve the economy. Mellon produced the largest tax cuts in history to the wealthy, which would introduce an economic theory that tax cuts to the wealthy would in turn help the lower class, resembling an economic theory called trickle-down economics, where the wealth will trickle down to the lower man. In August of 1923, President Harding suffered a fatal heart attack, thrusting his Vice President Calvin Coolidge into the office of the president. Coolidge would finish serving Harding's term and be re-elected in the election of 1924. The 1920s was a period of huge economic growth, and it was all done under the watch of these two men, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. So what type of policies are they putting forward? President Harding and Coolidge put Republican-based policies in place to immediately strengthen the economy and fix the government and business in the United States. The progressives at the turn of the century attacked businesses with big government and limited the amount of economic growth. To rescue the economy, Harding and Coolidge supported a return to the laissez-faire style of government and its involvement in business. If you remember when we covered the Gilded Age, laissez-faire is when the government is hands-off of business as a whole. During the Gilded Age, it led to a few men becoming super wealthy, and it will again lead to prosperity. The other policy that the Republicans supported was this idea of isolation. Remember when we covered U.S. imperialism and America's annexation of countries like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines? Imperialism is the policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force. It was one of the four main causes of World War I. Harding felt that it was time for America's dealings in foreign governments to come to a stop. President Harding's foreign policy ideas dealt with disarming nations and even agreeing not to go to war with any other countries. Imperialism was now dead, in what Harding called the country's return to normalcy. Now, presidencies sometimes aren't without their scandals, so for some short time that President Harding was in office, his administration was not void of any scandals. There were multiple instances of corrupt politics. It was also well known that to the people that Harding recommended for high government positions were corrupt. One such controversy was called the Teapot Dome scandal. The Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was accepting quote-unquote gifts from oil companies that he allowed to drill for oil and control the federal oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, an area of land that was set aside for the use of the U.S. Navy. This was a big no-no. Private companies should never be allotted such rights. The investigation found Fall guilty of bribery and conspiracy when the attorney uncovered that Fall was paid $385,000 and a large herd of cattle. Fall was jailed for 1 year as a result, leading to Fall being the first former cabinet officer sentenced to prison as a result of misconduct in office. So what about European nations returning to their normalcy? Well, as you remember, most of this war was fought in Europe, and after the death and destruction of World War I, European nations were terrified that another war like that could happen again. World leaders felt that if we did have another war like World War I, then the world would be destroyed. Countries tried many different ways to try and avoid another catastrophic war like the Great War and came to a solution. From November 1921 until February 1922, 9 countries met in Washington, D.C. at the Washington Naval Arms Conference. It was the first arms control meeting in history and attempted limited disarmament between powerful world nations like Britain, France, Italy, Japan, and the United States. Disarmament was the reduction of the armies and specifically the navies of the countries, putting a limit on the number of battleships the countries could control. Over time, some European countries felt like the Washington Naval Arms Conference was not going to be enough to keep the peace in the world, especially when so many nations relied on trade with the United States to rebuild their economies that were still suffering from war. With the war still fresh in everybody's mind, countries again came together to make a plan to avert another devastating war. In 1928, world leaders met in France to sign the Kellogg-Bryan Pact. The pact was a gentleman's agreement that promised not to use war to resolve disputes or conflicts or whatever nature or of whatever origin they may be, which may arise among them. Basically, it meant that it would outlaw war, but it did not lay out any real plan to enforce the pact. Originally, it was signed by the United States, France, and Germany, with 11 nations following quickly. By the time the pact was ratified, there were nearly 62 nations that signed the pledge. Today, there are more than 180 nations signed on. Many felt it was totally unenforceable, while others believed that it was a sign that most countries wanted to prevent another global conflict. One last goal of the European return to normalcy was figuring out a way that Germany wouldn't be absolutely destroyed economically due to the ramifications of the Treaty of Versailles. In steps Charles Dawes. In 1924, Germany's economy was in ruins. The Treaty of Versailles required that the country to pay back billions of dollars in reparations that they just could not afford. The underlying issue at hand was that if Germany couldn't pay the reparations to the Allied nations, they could not pay off their loan debt to the United States. Charles Dawes hatched an arrangement for Germany to help them pay back their reparations while helping the United States. And I'm going to lay this plan out for you and explain it in a minute. So number 1, Germany was poor and could not keep up with their reparation payments. Number 2, since Germany could not pay, France entered the Ruhrland in Germany in order to force the payment. Number 3, the United States would give Germany $200 million and help them set up a bank to help kickstart their economy. The U.S. would also set up a payment plan that the Allied powers would agree on. Number 4, Germany would pay France some of their reparations and France would leave the Ruhr. France would take that money and pay back the United States parts of their loan debt. Number 6, when Germany could pay, they would pay back the U.S. in part of their loan. It is a big circle of moving debt. With the German economy faltering, the U.S. stepped in and originally loaned them $200 million, set up the German National Bank, and a payment plan. $1 million for the first 5 years, and $2.5 million for every year after 5, as long as Germany was able to pay. U.S. banks would issue more than 100 long-term loans to Germany to assist their economy. Germany would take those loans and build their economy, then pay off the Allied powers the reparations that were owed by the Treaty of Versailles. This allowed the Allied powers, which was Britain and France, to repay their war debt to the United States, and Germany would pay back the loans to the United States as well. The U.S. helped everyone pay off their war debts with the U.S. banking loans. The Dawes Plan was successful with one caveat. It was 100% reliant on the American economy. All right, guys, I'll see you next time with installment 2 of the Roaring Twenties.